First story, the long haul. Mike Thornton was a seasoned trucker, the kind who had seen it all. With nearly 25 years on the road, he knew the highways like the back of his hand. He'd driven through every kind of weather, navigated treacherous mountain passes, and spent countless nights sleeping in the cab of his truck. But nothing had ever shaken him like the night he took a delivery route through the remote stretches of Arizona's desert. It was late October, and the sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the desert cloaked in an inky blackness. Mike had been hauling a load of electronics from California to New Mexico, a routine job that should have been easy. But as he entered a particularly desolate stretch of highway, his CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker, breaker, this is Old Scratch. You got your ears on?" Mike frowned. The voice was unfamiliar, and there was something off about it, a low, raspy tone that sent a chill down his spine. He hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the microphone. "Yeah, this is Iron Mike. Who's this?" There was a pause, and for a moment, Mike thought the connection had been lost. But then, the voice came back, even more unsettling than before. "You're on my road now, Iron Mike. Watch yourself." Mike released the button, his heart pounding. He'd heard about pranksters on the CB before, but this felt different. He checked his mirrors, scanning the empty highway behind him. There was nothing but darkness stretching for miles. Shaking it off, Mike tried to focus on the road ahead. The desert was eerily silent. The only sounds were the hum of his engine and the occasional howl of the wind. The highway was completely deserted. No other trucks, no cars, not even the distant glow of a town. Just endless miles of asphalt winding through the barren landscape. As he continued driving, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He caught himself glancing in his mirrors more often than usual, but each time there was nothing there, just the same empty road. Then, out of nowhere, the radio crackled again. "You're getting closer, Iron Mike, closer to the end." Mike's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He checked the dashboard. Everything seemed fine. The fuel gauge was good, the engine temperature normal. But the sense of dread was growing, creeping into his mind like a thick fog. Suddenly, the truck's headlights flickered. Mike cursed under his breath and hit the switch, but the lights only grew dimmer. The darkness outside seemed to press in, swallowing the feeble glow from his headlights until it felt like he was driving through a tunnel. And then, he saw it. A pair of faint, glowing red lights in the distance, hovering just above the road. They were too high to be taillights, and they didn't seem to be getting any closer. Mike squinted, trying to make out what they were, but the harder he looked, the more they seemed to blur and shift. The radio crackled one last time. "Almost there, Iron Mike. Time to pay the toll." The red light suddenly shot toward him, closing the distance in an instant. Mike slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding on the asphalt as he tried to avoid a collision. But the lights passed right through him, filling the cab with an intense, burning heat. And then, just as suddenly, they were gone. Mike's truck rolled to a stop, his heart racing. The highway was dark and silent once more. He sat there for a moment, trying to catch his breath, before finally pulling himself together. He needed to get off this road, and fast. But as he put the truck back in gear, something caught his eye. A figure standing on the side of the road, just a few yards ahead. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. He was wearing old, tattered clothes, and his skin was pale and weathered. Mike's blood ran cold. There was no way anyone could have been out here. He hadn't seen a soul for miles. But the man stood there, staring directly at him, unmoving. He slowly drove past the figure, his eyes locked on it the entire time. The man's gaze followed him, never blinking, never looking away. As Mike passed, he could see the man's mouth moving, as if he were whispering something. And then, in his side mirror, Mike saw the impossible. The figure was now walking behind the truck, keeping pace with it, despite the truck's increasing speed. Panic set in. Mike floored the accelerator, the truck roaring as it sped down the highway. He glanced back. but the figure was still there, now running alongside the truck, its legs moving unnaturally fast, its face twisted in a hideous grin. He couldn't outrun it. The radio crackled one last time, the voice of Old Scratch filling the cab. "You can't escape, Iron Mike. The road always claims its toll." The truck suddenly lurched to the side, as if something had slammed into it. Mike fought to keep control, but the wheel was yanked from his hands. The truck careened off the road, crashing into the desert with a bone-jarring impact. The last thing Mike saw before everything went black was the grinning face of the figure, its eyes burning into his soul. When the authorities found Mike's truck the next morning, it was a twisted wreck, half buried in the sand. The driver's seat was empty, the door hanging open. There was no sign of Mike, no footprints, nothing. They searched for days, but Iron Mike was never found. To this day, truckers traveling that stretch of highway report strange occurrences: flickering lights in the distance, mysterious voices on the radio, and the haunting figure of a man walking the road at night. They say that if you drive that road alone, late at night, you might hear a voice on the CB calling out to you. And if you do, it's already too late. The ghost of Highway 13. Sam Larson had always been a night driver. He preferred the solitude, the empty roads, and the cool night air that made long hauls easier to bear. He'd been on the road for nearly 2 decades, crisscrossing the country from coast to coast, and thought he had seen it all. But nothing had prepared him for the horrors he would encounter on Highway 13. Highway 13 was notorious among truckers. It was a desolate stretch of road cutting through the heart of the Midwest, surrounded by dense woods on both sides. Rumors circulated about the highway, stories of strange occurrences, vanished travelers, and ghostly apparitions that haunted the road at night. Sam had always dismissed these tales as nothing more than urban legends, campfire stories to scare rookies. But that was before he took the route on a stormy autumn night. The weather had been deteriorating all evening, with the wind howling and rain lashing against his windshield. Sam's GPS had rerouted him due to an accident on the main highway, leading him to the infamous Highway 13. He hesitated for a moment, the warning stories flashing through his mind, but shrugged them off. He was a seasoned trucker. No road was too tough for him. As he merged onto the highway, the first thing he noticed was how unnaturally dark it was. The dense canopy of trees overhead blocked out what little moonlight there was, leaving the road shrouded in almost complete darkness. His headlights seemed to struggle to pierce through the inky blackness, barely illuminating the road ahead. The miles ticked by slowly, the rhythmic thrum of the rain and the hum of his engine the only sounds breaking the eerie silence. As he drove deeper into the woods, a thick fog began to settle over the road, swirling around his truck like ghostly tendrils. The fog was so dense that Sam could hardly see a few feet in front of him. He slowed down, leaning forward in his seat to peer through the windshield. Suddenly, the CB radio crackled to life. The signal was faint, distorted by static, but Sam could just make out a garbled voice on the other end. "Help. Trapped. Need help." Sam grabbed the microphone, trying to respond, but all he got in return was static. He fiddled with the dials, trying to clear the signal, but the voice was gone. A chill ran down his spine. He hadn't seen another vehicle for miles. Who could be out here? As he continued down the highway, the fog seemed to grow thicker, the road disappearing into a wall of white. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow darted across the road in front of him. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding on the wet pavement. His heart pounded as he scanned the road, but there was nothing there. Just as he started to release the brake, something appeared in the fog. A figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible through the mist. It was a woman, her long hair hanging limply over her face, her clothes drenched from the rain. She was staring directly at him, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Sam's blood ran cold. Every instinct told him to keep driving, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something compelled him to stop. Against his better judgment, he pulled over to the side of the road. He rolled down his window slightly, the cold, wet air rushing into the cab. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he called out. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, unmoving, her eyes locked onto his. Sam felt a wave of unease wash over him. He was about to drive off when she suddenly pointed down the road, her finger trembling. "Help, them," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Before Sam could ask what she meant, she turned and disappeared into the fog. He stared after her, his heart racing. What the hell was going on? Reluctantly, Sam shifted the truck into gear and continued down the highway. The image of the woman burned into his mind. The fog seemed to close in around him, the road growing narrower and more treacherous with each passing mile. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, every nerve on edge. And then he saw it. Wreckage up ahead. A twisted mass of metal lying in the middle of the road. His stomach dropped. It was the remains of a car, crumpled beyond recognition, as if it had been in a horrific crash. The car's headlights flickered weakly, the only light in the oppressive darkness. Sam pulled to a stop and grabbed his flashlight, his hands shaking. He stepped out of the truck, the rain soaking him to the bone almost instantly. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and burnt rubber. As he approached the wreck, he could see that the car was empty. The driver's side door was hanging open and the seatbelt was unbuckled. His flashlight beam swept over the scene, and that's when he saw them. Footprints in the mud leading away from the car toward the woods. They were deep, as if someone had been running. A sense of dread washed over Sam. He didn't want to follow those tracks, but something inside him told him he had to. He had to find out what had happened. He started to follow the footprints, his flashlight barely cutting through the fog. The tracks led him deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around him, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The darkness was oppressive. The only sound was his own breathing and the squelch of his boots in the mud. Then, up ahead, he saw a faint light. It flickered like a candle flame, bobbing in the darkness. Sam's heart pounded as he moved toward it, the light growing brighter with each step. And then he saw them, the woman from the roadside, and several other figures, all standing in a clearing. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They were huddled together, staring at something on the ground. As Sam drew closer, the fog parted just enough for him to see what they were looking at. His blood turned to ice. It was the driver of the car, lying lifeless on the ground. His body was twisted at an unnatural angle, his face frozen in a mask of terror. But it wasn't the sight of the body that made Sam's breath catch in his throat. It was the fact that the figures surrounding the body were slowly turning to face him, their eyes locking onto his, their expressions vacant and hollow. Sam took a step back, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The figures began to move toward him, their movements slow and deliberate, their eyes never leaving his. The light from his flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, the sounds of the figures following close behind. Branches tore at his clothes and scratched his skin, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Finally, he burst out of the woods and onto the highway. His truck was just up ahead, the headlights cutting through the fog. He threw himself into the cab, slamming the door behind him. His hands shook as he started the engine, the tires spinning on the wet pavement as he peeled away. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel them watching him, could feel their cold, hollow eyes boring into the back of his head as he sped down the highway. Sam never took Highway 13 again, and whenever he hears the rain tapping on his windshield, he remembers that night, the night the road tried to claim him. He doesn't know what those figures were or why they targeted him, but he knows one thing for sure. Some roads are better left untraveled. The rest stop. Jake Turner was no stranger to the long, lonely highways that stretched across the country. A veteran trucker, he had seen just about everything the road could throw at him. But nothing could have prepared him for what he encountered one cold December night at a remote rest stop in the middle of nowhere. The evening had started like any other. Jake was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Los Angeles, a routine route he had driven countless times before. The winter weather was brutal, with snow falling heavily and the temperature plummeting as the night wore on. Visibility was poor, and the highway was nearly deserted. After hours of tense driving, Jake decided to pull over at a rest stop to get some sleep. He found a small, run-down rest area tucked away off the highway, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. The place looked abandoned, with only a single flickering streetlight casting a dim glow over the empty parking lot. There were no other vehicles in sight. Jake parked his rig and killed the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening after hours of the constant roar of the road. He glanced at the old, weathered building that housed the restrooms and vending machines. The windows were dark, and the place gave off an unsettling vibe, but Jake was too tired to care. He just needed a few hours of shut-eye before hitting the road again. He reclined his seat, pulled his cap over his eyes, and tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. There was something about the rest stop that put him on edge. The wind howled through the trees, and every creak and groan of the truck seemed magnified in the stillness of the night. Just as he was drifting off, Jake was jolted awake by a loud bang. He sat up, heart pounding, and looked around. The parking lot was still empty, and the rest stop building remained dark and silent. He wondered if it had been his imagination, but then he heard it again. A sharp, metallic clanging sound, like something heavy was being dragged across the pavement. Jake's hand instinctively went to the baseball bat he kept beside his seat. He wasn't about to take any chances. He peered out the window, trying to see through the swirling snow, but the darkness was impenetrable. The noise came again, louder this time, echoing through the night. It was coming from the far side of the parking lot, near the woods. Jake's grip tightened on the bat as he squinted into the darkness. Then, through the falling snow, he saw something moving. A figure, shrouded in shadow, slowly making its way toward his truck. The figure was dragging something behind it, the source of the clanging noise. As it drew closer, Jake could make out more details. The figure was tall and hunched, wearing tattered clothing that flapped in the wind. Its face was obscured by a hood, and it moved with a slow, deliberate gait, like it was in no hurry. Jake's heart raced as the figure approached. He could see now that it was dragging a long, rusty chain behind it, the link scraping against the asphalt with each step. The figure stopped about 20 feet from his truck, standing motionless in the snow. It was close enough now that Jake could see its breath, misting in the cold air. For a moment, everything was still. The figure just stood there, staring at the truck, the chain coiled at its feet. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Something was very wrong. He knew he should drive away, get the hell out of there, but he was frozen in place, unable to move. Suddenly, the figure lifted its head, and Jake caught a glimpse of its face, or what was left of it. The skin was pale and gaunt, stretched tight over sharp bones, with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. The lips were pulled back in a grotesque grin, revealing a mouthful of sharp, broken teeth. Jake's blood ran cold. He had seen enough. He turned the key in the ignition, his hands trembling, and the engine roared to life. But before he could throw the truck into gear, the figure lunged forward, slamming its hands against the driver's side window. Jake recoiled in terror as the figure pressed its face against the glass, its eyes wide and unblinking, its breath fogging up the window. The chain clanged against the side of the truck as it clawed at the door, trying to get in. Without thinking, Jake slammed his foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching on the icy pavement. The figure let out a blood-curdling scream as it was thrown backward, the chain rattling against the ground. Jake didn't look back. He sped out of the rest stop, the truck fishtailing on the slick road as he gunned it down the highway. His heart was pounding, his mind racing with fear and confusion. What the hell had he just seen? What was that thing? He didn't stop driving until he reached the next town, miles down the road. Even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. that the figure was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for him. Jake never used that rest stop again. In fact, he avoided Highway 42 altogether from that night on. But no matter how far he drove, no matter how many miles he put between himself and that place, he could never escape the memory of those hollow eyes staring back at him through the glass. He heard other truckers talk about strange sightings on the road, but he never shared his own experience. Some things were better left unspoken. But every time he pulled into a rest stop at night, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see that figure standing there, chain in hand, waiting to drag him back to that desolate stretch of highway where nightmares came to life.